Hello and welcome to the UKSIF Leadership Podcast. It's Oscar here on day 3 of COP26, discussing UK leadership on green taxonomies and global rules. I'm very pleased to be joined by James and Victor today. Victor is the Executive Director of Eurosif. Eurosif brings together the SIFs from across Europe, including us here in the UK and organisations in France, Spain, Switzerland, Italy, Germany and Ireland. Victor, it's really great to have you here. And James, we all know who you are by now, and I've kicked James out of the moderator chair today. And I'm really excited for the discussion ahead on taxonomies.
Hello, it's James and Sally here to let you all know about our podcast sponsor.
This COP26 series of the UKSIF Leadership Podcast is sponsored by Lion Trust. We're delighted to have them involved. Lion Trust is a specialist fund management company that was founded in 1995.
And as of July 2021, they had £34 billion in assets under management. Their aim is to have a positive impact on their investors, stakeholders, and society.
We're so pleased to have them on board for this series. Without the support of our partners, the podcast would not be able to happen.
So, without further interruption, let's get on with the episode.
Right, on to the first question. The UK government has published its Greening Finance Roadmap, setting out much needed policy clarity for the financial services sector on where sustainable finance regulation will go ahead in future. This included some new measures on the UK's green taxonomy and also on the UK's new disclosure requirements regime, the Sustainability Disclosure Requirements Framework. I'll start with you, James, if that's okay. It'd be really great to get any reactions that you might have to the update set out in the UK's Green Finance Roadmap on the UK's approach to the green taxonomy. And perhaps, are there any clues on this roadmap on the role of the Green Technical Advisory Group, of which UKSIF is a member, in the development of the taxonomy going forward?
Thanks, Oscar. Yeah, I mean, it's really good to have this clarity, and I think that's a really important thing. And that's actually what we get from this document is a degree of clarity. And we've been calling for this for some time. I think it's it's about time that we had this clarity. I'm really pleased that it's come out. We were, of course, somewhat involved in, or certainly we got some sneak peeks of some of the bits of the document, partly by our role on the Green Technical Advisory Group, helping develop and advise government, I suppose, on the green taxonomy. So, really pleased to see some of what we've been doing echoed and reflected in the document. So what does the document look at? Well, it covers, first of all, SDR, which is the UK's approach to SFDR, I think is probably the fairest way to describe it. Although I think it's realistic to say also that it's likely to be quite different. And I'm sure, Victor, I'm keen on your thoughts on what this difference is going to mean. But it's I think something we've been talking about is, how does SDR, how is it going to align across Europe? We know many of our members are selling products internationally. And so if there's many things doing the same thing, like what does that mean? So I'm sure we're going to talk about that a lot more today. Also, it talks about the green taxonomy and how the taxonomy will be being rolled out. Now, really what it does is it tells us things that we fundamentally knew already. The UK will have a green taxonomy. And that's partly because the UK has in statute the rules of the EU that were in place at the time that we left the EU, and that was those rules were already laid down that we would have a green taxonomy. It laid down the sort of framework and the structure of how the taxonomy would look, and the different areas it would cover, and things like do no significant harm. Of course, what it didn't do was go into the detail that the EU taxonomy has done in terms of the specific screening criteria, and so there is a chance that the UK's version again will be different. But the framework around it is the same, and that, to be honest, is the broad narrative that we get from the UK roadmap around the green taxonomy. Obviously, I'm sure again we're going to talk about what we're looking to achieve as UKSIF in the green taxonomy for the UK. It also has sections on stewardship. Broadly speaking, we think that's going in the right direction. Actually, it's really important, I think, that raising the profile of stewardship as a really key way for achieving our net zero future from from an investor perspective. It is one of the major levers that we have as investors that are not actually readily available elsewhere. And so, as UKSIF, passionately, we believe that stewardship has a really, really key role to play. So really great to see that called out. Throughout the document, there's references to the Sustainability Standards Board of the IFRS. There are few, if any, references to working with the EU or to mirroring some of the EU approaches. We can read into that what we want, I think, but what we also get is assurance from ministers that they're not going to invent different systems just for the sake of it. And we've been really hard to push ministers on that and say, please don't reinvent things if they work. If they're not working, fine, we can tweak them, but don't reinvent something just for the sake of it. And then there's also a couple of really interesting points in there around the development of a new labeling scheme for funds that could have an interesting impact on greenwash, and we know that consumers are confused, that they lack trust in the system, and research has shown that quite a bit. And then there's another really interesting piece which is on regulating data providers, and the expectation that ESG data providers will fall under the regulatory net at some point. How that's going to look, not sure, but interesting to see that government has that. What we do know, of course, is that for some time we've heard people expressing concern about the way that the data the data providers work, in the sense that there's a lot of black boxes. People don't know what goes on that creates the ratings that come out the other end, and maybe a bit more transparency on that would be valued by the industry. So, is that a helpful update, Oscar, on what's inside?
That's fantastic, James. And Contribution spoke a lot already. But before I turn to you, Victor, just one other question, James, relating to our involvement with the Green Technical Advisory Group. So, for our listeners, the Green Technical Advisory Group, or GTAG, is advising Treasury on the development of the UK's green taxonomy. UKSIF is proud to be a member of the GTAG, representing investors' views and expertise on this group. And James, just a follow-up question for me is, what role do you see the GTAG playing in the development of the taxonomy in the UK going forward? And do you think it's able to really exert significant influence over the development of the taxonomy? It'd be great to get your thoughts there.
Sure, thanks. I mean, I'm conscious you did actually ask me that question at the beginning, so sorry I didn't answer it. I guess, so GTAG has been set up to advise. The A of GTAG stands for advisory group, and the government has made it clear on a number of occasions that is what we do. We advise. We are not creating policy. We're not shaping this. But nevertheless, there are 18 people on that group, leaders in their field, major experts, who are coming together very regularly. In fact, I think it's fair to say that the period running up to the publication of the roadmap has been a sprint like crazy to just get us to the finishing line of COP, basically, and on some levels, I'm quite pleased we're now at that point, because we can now actually sit back and take more time to reflect and actually answer the questions and think very much more seriously. So on that sense, I'm quite pleased that the roadmap doesn't go into masses of detail on the taxonomy. And actually, that's what we wanted, because we need that next 2 years, which is the period of time where we're going to be constituted as GTAG to be getting more into the details and answering some of the key questions. Nevertheless, the GTAG has been instrumental in answering key questions like, should we diverge from or in what way should we diverge from the EU taxonomy? What other taxonomies around the world are going on? What's being developed? So yeah, I think we've got a big role to play. There's a lot of really key people that know a lot about what they're talking about. But I suppose one caution is that there are only 3 of us whose job is to represent financial market participants on the GTAG out of 18. And so we've got a really, really key role to do to bring in the views of members. So in that sense, what we've done as UKSIF, we've just constituted or created a kind of an advisory group to our participation in the advisory group. We're beefing up our policy capacity, and we will be engaging members very regularly on this. We've got a survey coming out relatively soon of members. So watch this space for that. But also we're going to have several roundtables, I think, throughout the next year, where we bring members together to try and get to the grips of key questions and key challenges that we want members to participate in.
Thanks very much, James. Really good to hear those reflections on your experience so far on the Green Technical Advisory Group. It'd be great to turn to you, Victor, next. The EU had its own version of the Green Technical Advisory Group called the Technical Expert Group. And it'd be fantastic to hear your thoughts, Victor, now on how might the UK GTAG learn from the Technical Expert Group in Europe, and are there any lessons for the UK to learn from the EU as it turns towards its taxonomy in the coming months?
Thanks, Oscar, and thanks for having me here today with you. I think that's, it's great to hear all the updates about the similarities and the direction of travel, and see the commonalities, and hopefully also see where UK is learning from the slight challenges that the EU Sustainable Finance Agenda has faced in its rollout. I think the EU's already now been for a couple of years embarking on the journey of a taxonomy. So I think while the system is not fully operational yet, I think we can already draw a number of interesting conclusions and lessons about how you go about the process. And I think the first one, I think, has been pivotal in the EU is the question of what are you actually seeking to define? What are you trying to achieve, and what are you trying to define? And for obvious political reasons, and to sidestep political hurdles, the EU decided to start off by defining a green list of what is actually sustainable. Take the challenge of climate change. What are the economic activities that, if we have them in a certain performance level, are fully aligned with a scenario of a Paris-aligned carbon-neutral economy in 2050? Which the advantage is it's a positive story. You don't tend to tar and feather anyone or point the finger at anyone. But the challenge is that when you do the analysis, you realize, a large part of our economies are not on that trajectory currently, which means that the size of activities covered is very small. And invariably, as a result of that, we've come very much to the debate of how do you cover off the transition in that system? How do you cover off transition finance? Because it's all, it's full fine and well telling us how the world should look like in 2050. But now the challenge is, how do you build the roadmap or open the map that shows you the journey from now to 2050? And that's all about transition and how different sectors need to decarbonize to meet that objective, and how that decarbonization and transition pathway looks for those sectors. And I think then you start facing very different challenges. So I think that's very important as a lesson for the GTAG, is to be very clear what you're trying to define from the onset. Because if your journey is not very clear, you might end up in a place you didn't expect or you didn't want to, and that kind of muddies the water. And we're seeing that now in the EU with the debate around should certain energy sources be included or not in the taxonomy? Are they green? Do they have the role to play? And I think what you see on many of those energy sources, I think it's undeniable that they all have some role to play between now and 2050. But it's also undeniable that some of them normally in 2050, if we reach the climate objectives, should have no or very little role to play anymore in the energy mix. I think it's these kind of discussions that I think we need to be very aware from the start what you're trying to do. I think that's, for me, the second biggest lesson to learn is, as well, what is the use case for the tool you're developing? And what we saw is initially the EU taxonomy was clearly defined as something targeting private finance, private investors, private capital, which, as we recall from the Paris Agreement, leveraging private finance is a key driver to achieve the climate objectives. So that was the rationale behind it. What you saw at the height of the COVID pandemic was the need to leverage a lot of public money to jumpstart the economy, to avoid that we enter into depression, and to smoothen the ride. Now, of course, it was, we all heard the slogans, build back better, a green recovery, and then the question invariably popped up of, maybe we should use taxonomy as well to think about our public spending for the next couple of years. And I think that's where you started to see I think the political resistance to something like taxonomy increased dramatically. And it increased dramatically, I think, both for wrong reasons and good reasons. Wrong reasons that it was a clear attempt at watering down some of the standards. Good reasons in the sense that a list designed to tell you how to spend your money and where to invest in 2050 is useful, but it's not that useful if you're deciding how to spend the money in the next 2 years, knowing the technological constraints and investment constraints in certain sectors that we know exist. So in that sense, second piece of advice is be very, very clear from the start what the use case is, because that allows, I think, to hopefully have a more informed debate about taxonomy, because I think taxonomy in the EU has been a kind of a piece of legislation that has suffered from a tremendous amount of fake news and fake facts and of dichotomies and contrasts that are just not justified and are not. We don't see some of those fears translated into the reality of how investors are going to implement and use that. So I think that would be kind of my two takeaways from don't necessarily or try avoid the pitfalls that we faced.
Do you think the EU taxonomy is no longer science-based? And I think this is a really, it's probably quite a hard question to answer. We're all talking about we've got to follow the science, we've got to follow science at 1.5 degrees. But it does feel to me like the EU taxonomy has gone away from science slightly. I mean, we hear a lot about gas being put into the taxonomy. Now, the whole point in my mind of the taxonomy is not that it just covers all of the bits of the industry that are there that exist right now, even if we don't want them. It's actually that these are the green bits that will gradually grow as a chunk of the economy as we reach closer to net zero. Now, whether or not that's the right approach for taxonomy, I'm not sure necessarily that it is, but that's another question. But still, putting gas in, for example, as being this is an example of super green stuff feels to me like it's wrong. And I just wonder, has it stepped away from the science? And can the UK actually learn that, take that lesson on board?
I think slightly controversial answer from my side. That's the fact. That's the reality of the matter. When you're 27 countries around the table with 27 different energy systems, economic systems, different sectors, you're invariably going to have to compromise, and people have different visions of that. You can take a classic example of bioenergy and forestry. Depending on which part of Europe you come from, you think it's either terrible for the environment, or you think it's the greatest thing for the environment that's ever happened. And somebody must be wrong in that debate. You can't. Science can't be both saying it's super sustainable and not sustainable. So, I think that's the reality of it. I think it's a pretty difficult statement at this stage to say whether we've deviated from science or not. But I think what's important is to understand: are you talking about green activities, like sustainable kind of 2050 aligned activities, if you want, or are you talking about transition activities? Because let's not forget the EU taxonomy does foresee in the existence of transition activities. Now, you've talked about gas. If you look at the IEA scenarios for 2050, it's clear that we may see a temporary short-term rise in the use of gas in the next 15 years. Potentially as a substitute for coal, which is a worse fossil fuel from a climate perspective even. So in that sense, transition, it makes sense to, can you ignore gas? Can you ignore nuclear? Probably not very much. But again, the question is, if the list is supposed to tell you what's aligned in 2050, then yes, it becomes very hard to explain why natural gas features in that list. So, but I think that's where unfortunately science hits political reality and the need to reach political compromises.
That's a really interesting point, Vic. And I suppose obviously the makeup of the EU with all the different member states and interests and sectors within those makes compromise very difficult, and it has made the process of delivering a green taxonomy in Europe very difficult. And I suppose, James, I want to ask you, can the UK avoid some of these issues experienced by European policymakers just because of the fact that, we are several nations and we aren't, far more member states. What do you think, James? It'd be great to get your thoughts. Is it even possible for us and for UK policymakers to learn from some of the mistakes in Europe?
Oh, I mean, absolutely, it's possible. I think Victor makes a really good point that trying to get 27 EU countries aligned around something is difficult when you try to do it around something that you've then publicly stated should be being used as the basis for short-term COVID recovery funds and everything else. You basically tie yourself completely up in knots, and as far as I can tell, make it completely impossible to get something that is perfect at that point. Now, of course, public policy is not about finding the perfect; it's about finding what can work. And so, I think we have a chance to get a taxonomy that potentially is going to be much closer to perfect perhaps than the EU has been able to do, because of the situation that we're in. And I suppose we've got a government that is very publicly, and in the roadmap I think talks about that they want the UK taxonomy to be aligned with science. We've been pushing really hard, learning the lesson from that Victor's outlined, and actually this is a really key promotion for why we are members of Eurosif, because we get so much amazing intel about what's going on in Brussels, and obviously what happens in Brussels affects us here in the UK. And so, trying to learn that lesson of this is not a Swiss Army knife. It doesn't serve 16 different functions in one go. It is one tool in the toolbox, and you make that tool to be perfectly designed for the function that it's supposed to form. And if you want to do something else, well, you need to find a different tool, and you need to use a different tool. That can be based on what we have, but it shouldn't necessarily be the same thing. And that's one of the messages that we're pushing on the advisory group. Keeping it science-based, keeping it aligned. And I think the government has said they want to see that happen, but of course aligned to the UK economy, the UK's transition pathway, and the UK's specific scenario around how it's going to get to net zero, which again I think is another thing that means that we perhaps might be able to get it more science-based. In terms of other things that we want to see from the taxonomy, I think one of the challenges is that obviously from today to tomorrow, we're not going to get to net zero. So we've got to make this work over the long term up to 2050, which is when we want to get to net zero. And so it's got to, not, in our view, not just have that thin slither of the economy that is completely net zero, that is perfectly aligned to net zero for the future. And I think the analysis of the EU taxonomy, Victor, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that's about 5% of the European economy was covered in the kind of green taxonomy. Now, for us, the challenge there feels that if you can't find an investment that meets your other investment criteria in that 5%, then what is the entire rest of the economy equally the same? It's either green or it's not green. I mean, that clearly isn't reality. It's not a binary thing. And so how do we make it so that there's the nuance, the shades of green? So you've got your kind of 5% that is the perfect green stuff that will make us hit 2050. The hope, of course, being, or the necessity being that increases over time. But you've also got investments then in other sectors that are under transition. The way I sometimes think about it is maybe, 5 years ago, we thought the Prius was about the greenest car you could buy. Of course, it still had fossil fuels, but it was a hybrid. But much of the technology that underpinned the Prius created the electric vehicles that we now use. And so obviously at some point the Prius, you no longer say a Prius is green, you say electric vehicle is green. And so the same I think is true for other areas of the economy, but in different stages of development. So there's key areas that we know we need and that aren't going to go anywhere. Concrete, steel making, these are key industries that need to transition, that are very hard to transition, but they're essential for the future. Aviation is another one. Obviously we need to reduce our flying, but actually we also need to find ways to fly more sustainably. And so, these are sectors under transition. And so we need to start thinking about incorporating the economy into the taxonomy, the areas of the economy that are under transition, and how that can be built in. Perhaps, and thinking this through, perhaps, with sunset clauses that say, we predict that this technology will be superseded by something greener in, the following year, or 2030, 2040, whatever it is. And that can be continually updated. And so, I think that this is one of the pieces. Now, I don't know, and Victor, actually really keen on your thoughts on that, but also more specifically, does that would we want to do that actually as a very kind of 700-page rule book like the taxonomy is, or are there ways of doing that in a more principle-based way where we kind of say, okay, we actually get, if you want to invest in something that you think is part of the transition, you've got to explain why you think that's part of the transition, rather than us necessarily writing a full list that says these are all the things that we think of the transition. Can that work? Can that principles-based approach work?
Yeah, I think that that there's a few things to untangle there, because I think you're right that the drawback we see with the taxonomy is that the share of the European economy aligned with the EU taxonomy is probably smaller than the 5% actually. But the fact is also, it's not binary in the sense that the rest is not green. It's just the rest is just not fully aligned with 2050. Now we know it's completely, it can be far from aligned, or it can be very close to. And that's the problem. Is the challenge is how do you capture all those very different realities in a system? And I think that for me, and that's very much on a personal basis here, but for me, I'm still always wondering whether a taxonomy, like a list that is relatively rigid, is the best way of capturing such a dynamic process, which we know that the transition is going to be rather dynamic. So I think that's something where I'm not entirely convinced that is the best way forward. I think on the point you made, like when we have sunset clauses, I think with the taxonomy, it's ultimately it's going to be a question of what do you want it to be? Do you want it to be a tool that sends strong signals to investors? We know for long-term investment decisions that investors like certainty. So they like certainty. And so building in sunset clauses or saying, I'm going to review all those standards every 2 years, builds in uncertainty in the system. And there, I think you get a question, right, is that then going to be the policy signal investors need to decide how to allocate their money? Or does the policy signal need to come from other public policy? And is the taxonomy then only just a reporting mechanisms so that the investors can inform the outside world and clients about how much effort they're putting into aligning or transitioning towards that objective? And on the transition, you're right. I mean, we know more or less which sectors of the economy need to transition. We know that some of them can. We know that probably some activities can't. I mean, we know that certain types of manufacturing are, for example, probably likely to still have some greenhouse gas emissions, even by 2050, even in the best technologies that we have. And we know it's going to be a very uncertain process. And I think that's the question then, because and I think that's for me where you see the debate now shifting towards is can you capture a transition in a taxonomy, or are you potentially better off looking at things like transition pathways and defining on a principles based what a transition of a particular sector or country looks like, and then get companies to report against that and report on are they on that trajectory, are they miles off, or are they actually hopefully overshooting their own ambition and ahead of schedule. And I think that's a different discussion.
And to stick with you, Victor, if that's all right, where do you think Europe is heading on this? Do you think we'll ultimately see a transitional taxonomy? I think it's Canada that is due to publish its own transitional taxonomy by the end of this year, I believe. So to put you on the spot a little, Victor, with a prediction, where do you think things will head in Europe? Or is it a bit hard to determine at this point?
I think hard to determine. I think we'll probably have some form of transition list, but again, the challenge I think we might face there is that you can't have a universal answer for the whole of Europe. And what I mean by that is, if say, and when I want to pick on particular countries, but if, for example, a country has a energy mix, for example, where coal is still very much present, them switching to gas is a relatively good thing. It's in absolute terms probably not where you need to go by 2050, but it's still improving it already. Whereas if you're in another country where renewables are already dominant and very present, then allowing that, saying to that country, I'm going to build gas-fired power plants, that's not really the transition we need. So I think that's also going to be the challenge is the fact that different countries, different sectors are at different starting points, and how do you get them to improve, which in a way that aligns with the absolute objective, which is Paris alignment by 2050, in recognizing that regional difference and not having one list deciding it for everyone.
Is that really? Are we really in the position where some countries are going to transition via gas to renewables? Do we have to be in that position, or is that just the pragmatic reality of the situation we're in?
It's the pragmatic. Reality we are now. Obviously, I think everyone would love those countries to make a technological jump, forego gas entirely and move straight to renewables. That'd be great. But I think at this stage, and the debate might be very different in 6 months' time. But the fact is now, the unfortunate thing of COP happening now is that we are in the middle of a high energy price crisis, which means that suddenly things like the security of supply of energy is for politicians of paramount concern. 6 months ago, I think that probably far fewer politicians would have security of supply for energy as high on their list of priorities.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a fair point, and clearly that's hit the UK as much as it's hit elsewhere. The British government's response to that, interestingly, has been that nuclear needs to be right at the heart of everything, and actually you see that through all of the net zero plans that have been published. Not just consideration of building big new nuclear power stations, but considering kind of mini nuclear power stations. I don't know if that technology actually even exists yet, but that's what the government is talking about here to do security. It's about clearly not every country in Europe, I think in specific of Germany, is very excited about nuclear. So yeah, interesting.
Some other countries are much more excited about nuclear.
Yeah, obviously France, of course.
But no, it was interesting, James and Victor, to see that commitment to nuclear in the net zero sector strategy published last month by the UK government, and indeed it featured quite prominently in Boris Johnson's speech to Conservative Party conference, citing nuclear as part of the solution to the net zero transition. I've really very much enjoyed this portion of the discussion, and I think it probably leads us very neatly into the final part of discussion for the sort of final 5 minutes or so around the experience of different countries with their taxonomies, and how can we encourage a little bit more harmonization, or at least coordination on the development of taxonomies going forward. Clearly, it's not just the EU and us here in the UK who have started work on a green taxonomy. Canada is also looking at this. China, I think, as well, although the United States actually recently has said that it has no plans currently to look at a green taxonomy, which I thought was very notable. So my question to you, James and Victor, is, is the promise of delivering harmonization and coordination on international taxonomies, is this a noble objective? To what extent is this a realistic objective for the UK and the UK to pursue? Or is this going to end sort of badly for both Europe and the UK? Perhaps start with you, Victor.
I always like to be optimistic, but in this case, I find it hard to be optimistic and being realistic. I'm not certain we will see full harmonization. I think what we can hope for is that the principles behind what a taxonomy should be and the core principles and building blocks are the same, whereby you get the same, I guess, policy intent behind it, and therefore you see minimal divergence. But unfortunately, I do think we're going to see divergence simply for the reason that if it's a list, if it's meant every time as a list or as a framework to kind of help steer investors towards particular investments, again, it's the transition. It's about where you go to. So you may see, I think, rather similar green taxonomies, because the end station, particularly for, I think, very developed economies, you'd be surprised that they're very fundamentally different. So I think, they probably are going to be rather similar. I think it's where you come to the transition bit where I think you'll see a lot of divergence simply because the paths are different. I mean, we've got countries with strong manufacturing sectors. We've got countries with large agricultural sector. We've got countries around the world that are commodity exporters. We've got emerging markets that are different, and obviously the answer is not going to be the same for all those countries in exactly the same way. So therefore, unfortunately, I think there will be divergence. And the question is, does it really matter that there's divergence in the grand scheme of things, or not?
Be great to get your views, James, as well on this issue of divergence versus harmonisation. Is there a role for the UK to support efforts globally to encourage a better coordination of taxonomies? Or once again, is this a bit of a naive, unrealistic objective for the UK to pursue?
I mean, I think in answer to Victor's last comment, it definitely does matter that there is this convergence. We are a global industry. People are investing internationally. They've got clients internationally, not least between the UK and the EU, where of course up till recently we were part of the same basically trading bloc, and so there is huge amounts of crossover there. And so I think it does matter, and I think that we do actually need to be taking this more seriously as a problem. But I also agree with Victor. This is going to get worse before it gets better. And I think we are, unfortunately, the argument that we've been making, I think Victor as well, that we should be in a competition for skills. We should be in a competition for innovation, for reputation and other things. But we should not be in a competition for standards and approaches and regulation. I think that argument has not been won, and I think there is definitely a view that countries will put in place the regulation that they think is right, almost kind of in that slight vacuum. And I think it's very easy for countries to forget that they are existing in a global marketplace and working internationally, and that's a shame. And I think that time will start. Over time that will start to change, but I think it is gonna be problematic first, and then it will work more effectively. Now, the one thing that we do have in our favour is that the UK has said a lot that it is going to work with the ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is being set up by the IFRS Foundation. And I think at some point over this COP, we're going to get an announcement of some of the members of that, is my expectation. And we look to that to rapidly start coming up with some approaches. My concern, though, is that this becomes a lowest common denominator thing, and that they'll just try and get over the line what can be agreed across the different countries they work in and across the group. And unfortunately, the reality of the climate challenge is the lowest common denominator is not going to solve it. And so, any country that's serious about taking action will look at what ISSB is doing and say, well, we're going to have to do more. We have to do more. There is still a scenario that it's not lowest common denominator, and we actually get some quite forward-thinking work coming out of them, and that's of course what we're pushing for, and I'm sure Victor's the same. But we'll just have to wait and see on where that lands. But yeah, I think that's where we'd like. I
think on that point, I think it's interesting to see here this. I think I wouldn't call it tug of war, but it's this strange interaction with the efforts done by the EU at this stage as well, which obviously have a slightly different remit in terms of scope and topics it's trying to address, and the way it's looking at those reporting standards. Because I think the EU has been quite careful to be supportive of the ISSB, but exactly to your point, James, saying we're not going to wait for the lowest common denominator. If we feel we need to move forward, we are going to move forward. Now, you're right that brings challenges of harmonization and fragmentation with it. But I think that's, again, it's interesting to see that the probably political realities or the political appetite for certain things is different in different countries as well.
And the one thing I think we've got in our favour, though, is that the UK is quite keen to work internationally. It's keen to assert itself internationally. We all forget this, but its presidency of the COP starts this week and lasts for a year. It's not over by the end of the next, this fortnight that we're in. And actually, also we have the finance stocktake happening at the next COP, as I understand it. And so this could actually be a year where the UK's presidency does actually have some focus looking at finance, and where the UK might be able to use some of its international leadership that is building through presidency of the COP to start pushing for some of these things and pushing for some of this to move further and faster and to be a bit more aligned. And my sense is that there are other countries that would be amenable to that. Diverging for the sake of diverging is not in anybody's interests, I don't think. And I think the more that we as financial services say that as well, the stronger that message comes across.
Thanks very much, James and Victor. We're very unfortunately coming to the end of today's podcast. And I think it'd be great to get reflections from both of you in terms of, what are some of the next steps that those of us listening who are UKSIF's members should be looking out for? Where are things going to go in the UK in the next few months, and also in the EU, where are things going to be going? Maybe start with you first, Victor. Will there be some clarity on the treatment of nuclear and natural gas? Will there be some clarity for these sectors coming in Europe for its green taxonomy? Thank you.
I think that's the $1 million question always. I think if something from the EU sustainable finance has shown us in the last 3 years is that timelines is never always the timelines we expect. So I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that. But I think what we can expect is indeed further discussions on covering off other environmental topics. Let's not forget, taxonomy discussion for now has been dominated entirely by the climate agenda. We have barely really touched on the nature and biodiversity agenda. We haven't really dealt with the circular economy, water use, which are tremendous challenges of their own. So I think definitely we'll see that. There will be invariably the question of how do we extend those discussions to the more social remit. Do we do a social taxonomy? If so, what shape does it take? Is it similar or different to the environmental taxonomy? So I think those discussions on the one hand, and further, we will probably see some developments along the line of what you discussed in the UK roadmap at the beginning, which is that probably the whole debate about transparency and disclosure of financial products, the SFDR, that's going to rumble on for a while. And we may see some developments there and some policy discussions on whether the regime is working, whether it needs tweaking, and finally, our expectations also obviously that the question of data providers and ESG ratings and how do you regulate those? What are the public policy problems you're trying to solve? Is that transparency? Is that the fact that you have a limited number of large suppliers out there? So what is the policy challenge that you're trying to address for regulation, if any? And I think we'll see those discussions emerge at European level as well. And I think there it will be important indeed that we hopefully have some coordination between the UK and the EU to make sure that that we don't end up with different rules, because the data and information is at the heart of this whole agenda. Whether you talk taxonomy, disclosure, benchmarks, ESG ratings, it's everywhere.
That's great. Thank you very much, Victor. And James, I think the last word will be with you for today's podcast. A sense, like Victor's question, a sense of what's coming down the pipe for our members in the UK.
Yeah. I mean, definitely, I was going to say some of the same things that Victor said, particularly that focus on nature. I had the City Minister, John Glenn, saying just the other day that they are very aware that that climate change is not the only E issue in ESG, that there are huge challenges around nature, biodiversity, and other things. We wrote a letter recently to the government talking about this, which we got a very positive response to. And I think there is the other COP that we forget about, which is the COP related to biodiversity, which has kind of been split into two parts and happening in China. And that's equally big challenge, TNFD as well as TCFD. starting to come forward. Those of you that were able to join the UKSIF AGM a couple of weeks ago would have heard from Sasha Sadan, the new Director of ESG at the FCA, and the first time that post has actually existed. So he's a force of nature and has some really interesting and big ideas for how he wants to see things move forwards, and I think very forward thinking. And then I think the other piece is transition plans. And there's something I forgot to mention when summing up the roadmap, was that there's a big piece about transition plans, and looking at not just transition plans for financial services, but transition plans for corporates more generally, and the expectation that those are going to, there's going to the pressure to create them and produce them, and to make sure that they are, it's not just a sort of, oh yeah, we're going to be net zero by 2050, but it's actually a case of, well, how? What are the details that underpin the question, that statement, and what are you going to be doing next year and the year after and the year after that? Not just some target long into the future beyond the point where the current management of a company no longer is in post. So I think these are really big topics that are going to start coming to the fore. And I think that's, there's a lot of positives in there. This is an agenda that I think we're now in a stage where tackling climate change, the role of financial services in that is undisputed. Where it's recognized that alongside every other part of the economy, we've got to act as well. And also as an industry, we recognize that we want to act and we want to play our part, and we know that we need to do that. So we're in a really strong position. We've got governments across the world that are supportive of taking climate action to a greater or lesser degree. So things are moving in the right direction. The question, of course, is will they move fast enough to meet the scale and speed of the challenge that we need to address?
That's great. Thanks so much, James. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our podcast for today, unfortunately. Thanks so much, both. It's been a really excellent discussion. We've covered so much ground in our discussion today. Just to say to all our audience, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tune into our other episodes coming up throughout COP26. You can find us on Twitter at UKSIF, that's all one word, and speak soon. Thanks.